Hello and welcome to the third video in a series of videos on systems thinking. My name is Bhaskaran and I am your faculty walking you through this series. In this video, I am going to explain to you some of the concepts of systems thinking. Why this is important is that these concepts will help you define a system in its entirety. How else would you know whether you're thinking about a problem or a situation from a systems perspective? There are four fundamental concepts that one needs to understand. The first of these concepts, it's what's called hierarchy. Any system worthy of discussion, worthy of study, is always typically comprises of hierarchies of subsystems. On this diagram, for example, we're talking about an automobile. And an automobile is fairly complex in its own, right? So you've got the engine subsystem, you've got the infotainment subsystem, and you've got the safety subsystem. The engine subsystem in turn consists of fuel injection and the powertrain, while the safety subsystem on the other hand consists of airbags, consists of anti-lock braking systems, and consists of vehicle stability. In this sense, you could break down a system into as many subsystems at different hierarchies as you will. It is important because when a system is conceptualized in the form of nested hierarchies, it is easier to appreciate, easier to understand, and easier to discuss. Obviously, you need to specify the level of the hierarchy when you define a system. How abstract do you want that definition to be versus how granular do you want that definition to be? The second concept of a system, an extremely important concept of a system, is what's called the boundary. As we explained earlier, a system interacts with its environment. Now, if a system is to interact with its environment, you need to understand what is the boundary of the system. Therefore, anything that happens within the boundary is internal to the system, and anything that happens outside of this boundary is external to the system. For example, in the human body, typically the skin is considered the boundary of the human body as a system, and the skin takes a lot of inputs from the external world, and the human body changes itself, changes its behavior based on those inputs. Now, why is this concept so important? First of all, of course, it helps you define the size of the system that you're talking about. But more importantly, remember that the moment you have defined the boundary of a system, you have also defined what's called the friction point of the system with its environment. What do I mean by this? So suppose I took my finger and placed it on a hot plate. So remember, the skin of my finger is the boundary of my system. That skin senses the hot plate temperature and immediately withdraws the hand. The friction in this case was the high temperature on the skin. Similarly, suppose you were talking about software development, and you said the boundary is as defined by the R&D organization of a company. The friction exists between the boundary of the R&D organization and, for example, the marketing organization. So the marketing organization says, I want X. The R&D organization has understood it as Y. And therefore, the R&D organization continues to develop Y. On the other hand, if the system boundary was expanded to include the marketing organization, this communication gap would be much less. Therefore, choice of the boundary, choice of the hierarchies of a system are extremely important when you define a system. The third concept in a system is what's called cybernetics. You remember that when we defined a system, we said a system needs feedback. And cybernetics is the study of feedback. Every system, any system, takes inputs from its environment and alters its behavior, changes the subsystems, etc. based on those inputs. It does this so that the system in itself can continue to maintain stability. So in my previous example, I placed my finger on a hot plate. This is a feedback to my system, to the human body. The human body immediately withdraws the hand, and so that it re-establishes stability. If the finger was continue to be positioned on the hot plate, you would burn. That is an unstable situation for the system. So feedback, the study of feedback, the understanding of feedback is extremely important to understanding a system. Understanding feedback is one of the primary techniques that you would use to come to a solution of an unstable system. So cybernetics is the third concept that one must understand if one is studying systems. The final concept, the fourth concept, is the concept of complexity. Now we spoke about hierarchy as one of the first concepts. Hierarchy by definition leads to this concept of complexity. Remember, a system consists of multiple subsystems, and those subsystems in turn can have subsystems. That's what we conceptualized as nested hierarchy. Complexity takes this a step further. It says that a system can consist of many components. Each of these components are now dynamically interacting with each other. If each of these components were static and isolated in the form of an island, in the form of an OS, it really does not play a large role in the way the system functions. The system functions the way it does because of the interactions, the dynamic interactions between these subsystems or components. In turn, these subsystems may have further subsystems, and those subsystems would interact with each other. This kind of interaction amongst subsystems of a system leads to what the complexity of the overall system. But the positive side of this kind of complexity in turn leads to what is called emergence, the behavior of the overall system. I'd like to close this video with giving you an example of what is not systems thinking. For example, in this image, there is a person who is in an apartment, and there is a fire in the apartment below him. Now he could choose to have said, hey, my apartment is my boundary. I don't care what happens outside of that. On the other hand, if he did that, the fact is that there is a fire that has got friction with his boundary. He has to take action, he has to respond, otherwise he loses stability. He could have, on the other hand, said, you know what, my boundary encompasses the apartment below, and then I have to take action based on what's happening within my system. Systems thinking permits these kinds of permutations and combinations. In summary, we have spoken about 4 concepts that will help you define a system. The fact that systems are nested in a hierarchy, the fact that the boundaries of a system and the interface of that boundary with the environment causes friction and causes stability or instability in a system. The concept that for a system to work properly, it must have some form of control mechanism, cybernetics. And the final concept that systems are inherently complex. Using the 5 characteristics of a system that we studied in the last video and the 4 concepts of a system that we studied in this one, it should become easier for you to understand what a system is and how to define a system. We will elaborate on these in further subsequent videos. Till then, I would again urge you to do a lot of reading. There is a lot of material out there. And thank you for watching this video.